Thank you, Michelle. When I was in college, I was a religion major and elected. I didn't have to, but I took a year of New Testament Greek. I don't know if you're aware of this, though, but you don't use New Testament Greek on a regular basis. And anyway, I didn't blow it out of the water or anything, but as I recall, I made B's both semesters. So I did pretty well in that. And so that was my freshman year, completed 4 years of college, then went on to seminary. And the master's track that I was on required a year of New Testament Greek and a year of Hebrew. And I anticipated, though I have forgotten a great deal, so much of this is going to come back to me once I get back into class and start going back over these things that I've learned before. And so that first year of seminary, I signed up to take Greek, and I was taking it with a professor whose name was Andreas Kostenberger. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I soon discovered Dr. Kostenberger, though the Bible doesn't tell us, I discovered he is the Antichrist. And anyway, I signed up for Kostenberger's class, and the semester began, and we're going over basic stuff like the Greek alphabet, and all of that's coming back to me. Basic, most frequently recurring Greek words in the New Testament, all that stuff's coming back to me. The quizzes that I'm taking, I'm just blowing those out of the water, getting hundreds on all of those. I'm not doing any homework. I'm not studying. I'm not having to do any of that. I'm just coasting because it's all coming back to me. So the first exam, those get passed out. I begin working on it. I'm doing great, and I'm going through each of these pages, answering all these questions. I'm feeling pretty good about how prepared I was for this and how much I knew. I turned it in. The next class period, he turns those back, gives those back to us graded. And I really thought that I did better, but I got an 84. Now, an 84, that's nothing to write home about. It's not terrible, not great. I thought I had done better. I hadn't, so I thought, okay, I'll just do better next time. Again, I'm still coasting. I'm not studying, not doing homework. I'm just showing up for class. And so it's time for the next exam. I sit there with this exam, and I have never in my life known less for a test than I did for that one. My face was red. I could feel the sweat pouring off my brow, and page after page I would think, I don't know that, I don't know that, I don't know that. I don't know that. I don't know anything. And so finally I turned the test in, and as I turned the test in, I'm hoping, please, Lord, at least let it take him a couple of weeks to get these things graded and back to us. Well, he had a fast grader, and so the very next class period, Kostenberger gives these back to us. And apparently his grader had to buy a new red pen after he graded my exam. I got a 32 on that exam. I don't know if you're aware of this, but a 32 is a whopper of an F. Like a 60 is an F. A 32, that's like an F minus, minus, minus. If I had not shown up, I would have only done 32 points worse. I mean, it was just absolutely terrible. At this point, I'm keenly aware of the fact I have been coasting and coasting and coasting, and I have been coasting right into failure is what I am doing. I recognized I was in a deep hole. I was way behind. The class was so far ahead of me, and I start busting it, trying to study and to do everything I possibly can. The next exam was given back out. I did slightly better. This time I got a 34, 32, 34. If that's your waistline, that's not bad. If it's your Greek exam, not very good. And so at that point, my test scores are 86, 32, 34. It was not mathematically possible for me to pass the class, regardless of what I made on the final. I didn't even show up. I took a 0 for the final and showed up to take Greek all over the next year with a different professor. But let me ask you this. Why did that happen? Why did I experience such lack of success? Because I was coasting. I'd done this before. I had experienced success in the past. And because I was coasting, I just coasted right into failure. What I did in that Greek class, so many times we as those that are followers of Christ, we so often do. Because of what we've experienced in the past, because of close encounters with the Lord, because of great weeks of vacation Bible school or Sunday school classes that we've taught or people that we've led to the Lord, all of those things being in the rearview mirror, it is so easy for us to coast on those successes that we just coast right into failure. The truth is that's not anything new. In fact, even those that were closest on earth to Jesus, the disciples, experienced exactly the same thing. And what we can see from their coasting shows us what our own coasting reveals about us. So what does our coasting, our spiritual coasting, reveal about us? Look with me in your Bibles today to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, as we continue to work our way through Mark's gospel, we pick up today in verse 14. Mark chapter 9, verse 14, we're told that Jesus came to the disciples and he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, running to him and greeting him. And Jesus asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." He answered him and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." Then they brought the boy to him, and when he saw Jesus, immediately the spirit convulsed in him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. He asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." The spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and he came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him up by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked Jesus privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." What I believe we have going on here is an example in the disciples of something that regularly we do as disciples of Christ, and that is that we just coast. We have these significant experiences, significant accomplishments, significant successes that are in the past, and we just continue to coast on them so that we get to the point where we can do nothing in the Lord's name. But what does that show about us when we are coasting, when we are doing this? What does it reveal about us? Well, the first thing that it shows us is this. It shows us that failure is lurking. It shows us that failure is lurking. As this passage begins, Jesus steps into a scene that is already occurring. There you have this massive crowd that is gathered around the disciples, and there's clearly this argument that is taking place. And Jesus comes up and he asks the question in verse 16, "What are you discussing with them? What's all the commotion?" And out of the crowd, instead of one of the disciples answering, this man speaks up and he begins to describe to Jesus the problem with his son. And he says that his son is demon-possessed. It's left him mute. It causes him to convulse. It causes him to foam at the mouth. It just takes control of him. And I have come to your disciples in hopes that they could do something. But verse 18 is significant. Notice the end of it. This father says, "So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." I came to your disciples so that they could do this, but they could not. Now, the New Testament is replete with examples of the disciples performing varied manners of miracles, all sorts of things that they were able to do, the least of which was to cast out a demonic spirit. But here they have this opportunity where they can do that, but they fail. Somebody brings to them and presents to them the need. They have the opportunity. They have the chance to do something in Jesus' name, but what can they do? Absolutely zero. Why is that? I believe the answer to that actually is revealed to us in the verses leading up to this text. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 9, we read this amazing, miraculous event that takes place as Jesus has this experience with those that were closest to him, with Peter, James, and John up on a mountaintop. We refer to this as the Mount of Transfiguration. And what happens is that Jesus, his full divinity is revealed. The fact that he is God is fully revealed. He glows in radiant brightness. Elijah and Moses are there in appearance. They also appear. So Peter and James and John, they're standing there with Jesus and his full godhood revealed before them. Moses, the great prophet, Moses, the great lawgiver, Elijah, the great prophet, standing there before them. And then there is this voice of the Father saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Now, this is not simply a once-in-a-lifetime type of experience. This is a once-in-the-course-of-human history type of experience. And Peter and James and John, they get to have this amazing, monumental experience. This experience for the ages. And so they come down from the mountain. And they have both literally and figuratively had a mountaintop experience. And as soon as they have descended the mountain and had this experience, they're presented with an opportunity to be used by God to demonstrate the power of God. And what can they do? Absolutely nothing. They tried and tried, but to no effect. Why? Because I believe they were resting on the successes of the past. They were resting on their mountaintop experiences. They're just reveling in the glory. Man, we have seen the glory of God revealed in the person of Jesus. We've heard Him indicate or suggest that He's God, but we have seen tangible, empirical proof. He is God in human flesh. We've seen the great lawgiver Moses. We've seen the great prophet Elijah. We've audibly heard the voice of the Father. Man, it doesn't get any better than this. Still reveling in all of that. And when push comes to shove, when the rubber meets the road, they can't do anything. Why? Because I believe, quite frankly, they were coasting on the successes, coasting on the experiences, coasting on the mountaintop moments of the past. And what does this show us about them, or what was getting ready to happen? It shows us that failure was lurking. Listen, I want you to understand that exactly what Peter, James, and John have done is exactly the same thing that you and I can do because of what we have experienced in the past. Maybe it was your own personal mountaintop experience with the Lord. Maybe it was something that took place at camp while you were a teenager, or some retreat that you went on, or some revival service, or some unique encounter that you had with God that just did amazing things in your heart. Or maybe it's because of years of faithfulness and seeming success in teaching a Sunday school class, or people that you have won to the Lord. And all of these things that have occurred in the past, what happens so easily is that we just rest on those. We depend on those. Well, I don't really need God to do something else. I don't need a fresh encounter. I don't need a fresh experience. I don't need a fresh word from the Lord. I don't need anything fresh because I've got all of this stuff in my back pocket. I've got all this stuff in my wheelhouse. Got all of these things that I've experienced in the past. And what happens is that we're putting faith in those things and not faith in the Savior. And what happens? We can do absolutely nothing. When I was little, I used to absolutely love to ride my bike. And I remember one year for Christmas, I got a 10-speed bike. And when I got it, I remember that Christmas, it was bitter cold, but I was out there, icicles hanging off my nose and ears, just blazing through the neighborhood, loving this. And I was just flat riding the wheels off of this bicycle. I loved it. And my birthday was a couple of months later, and for my birthday, my parents gave me a speedometer to put on this bike. And so then not only would I know how far I have gone, but how blazing fast I was going too. And so I used to love this. And every day I'd get out after school and I would ride my bike. And my favorite place to ride, though, in the neighborhood across the street from us was at the very back of the neighborhood, and there was this big hill that you would approach and this steep decline. And so what I would do is I would approach that hill and go as fast as I possibly could. And once I have crested this enormous hill, I'm going down, and I would tuck, and I would watch that speedometer go up, 80, 90, 100 miles an hour, that I was just blazing down this hill. I'd come down the hill, I'd reach the bottom, and then I'd start climbing again. But you know what I had to start doing? I had to start pedaling. Because if I didn't start pedaling again, what was going to happen? The momentum would stop, and if momentum completely stopped, I was going to fall off the bike. Listen, what was true for me with my experience with a bike, you with your experience in the bike, is so true with us also as it relates to spiritual things. And it's wonderful that we have these amazing mountaintop experiences with God, but what we've got to do is keep pedaling. That momentum gets us going in the positive direction, but that's no excuse to let up and say, boy, I used to be going really fast. I used to have this experience. I used to have this amazing encounter with God. I used to have God work and do amazing things in and through me. Because when we start relying on those, it shows us that failure is lurking. Now, here we find ourselves on the cusp of the celebration of our country's independence. A couple of times this morning we have either sung or heard from the choir today sing a patriotic song. And it is so easy for us as evangelical conservatives to lament the condition of our country because we're in a fix. We're in the dumps. And I'm not talking about economically. I'm not talking militarily. I'm talking about the moral condition of this country. It is absolutely deplorable. And we've seen that confirmed just this past week through the decisions rendered by our Supreme Court justices. Why is it that the ACLU is so successful in this country? Why is it that the gay rights movement has been so ridiculously successful in this country? Why is it that the pro-abortion advocates in this country have been so successful? Why is it that the evolutionary cosmologists have been so successful in indoctrinating our children from the earliest of ages that God has nothing to do with the creation of the world? Why is it that they have been so successful? I'll tell you why. Because we've just been coasting. We've either been coasting on our own successes and victories in the past, or we're coasting on the successes of our forefathers. Those that understood this, those that believed this, those that taught this. I want you to understand, those that are enemies of God and those that are enemies of the moral stance that we take, they have not let up, so why should we? We let up, we start coasting. It shows us, just like the disciples, failure is lurking. But there's another thing it shows us about ourselves, and that's this. Faith is lacking. Faith is lacking. This man comes to Jesus, and he's told him, this is the condition of my son. And this horrible picture he's painting for the agony that his son is enduring. And he says, I brought my son. Verse 18, he says, but the disciples, they could not cast it out. And Jesus responds in verse 19, and he says, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. And I believe this is actually a statement not so much directed to the Father, but rather it's directed to his disciples. And so he says, in essence, all right, since you guys can't do anything, go ahead and bring him to me. And of course, we know what Jesus does. He makes the boy whole. He casts the demon out. He restores him. But that comes after some awfully biting words to his disciples. The first thing he says to them is, how long shall I be with you? The disciples don't get this, but Jesus is keenly aware of the fact he has a limited amount of time. His ministry was going to span just 3 short years, and the clock was ticking. Time was flying by. And Jesus is trying to say, listen, I'm not going to be here forever. I'm not going to be with you physically present forever. So you're going to need to be prepared for this. What are you going to do when I'm gone? But then he calls them something else. He calls them a faithless generation. He calls them a faithless generation. Now, I would argue that the disciples had faith, though Jesus references them as faithless. But I would say they had faith, and I do so on this basis. They had faith, but it was wrongly positioned. Their faith was in themselves. Their faith was in what they had accomplished. Their faith was in their mountaintop moments, significant experiences in the past. Oh, we've done all of this before. We can do this. We've been there, done that. We've experienced this before. Their failure was not simply lurking, but Jesus indicates that their faith, it was also lacking. And it was lacking because it was wrongly positioned. It was wrongly placed. Listen, when you and I likewise put our faith and our confidence and we take real solace of heart based on the things that we've done in the past. I mean, those of you this past week who are just absolutely exhausted from a wonderful week of Vacation Bible School, listen, I thank you. This church is indebted to you. But it is not time to throw your heels up on the couch and say, okay, done. Been there, done that. Just because you have been faithfully teaching a Sunday school class, or just because at some point in the past you have successfully led someone to faith in Christ, listen, that is no time to stop. It is no time to let up. Jesus says in verse 23, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. What can be accomplished in the present and what can be accomplished in the future rests solely not on your faith, rather the object of your faith. The disciples that are fruitless in this experience, fruitless at this moment, it is not because of a lack of faith, rather it was faith in the wrong place. Faith in themselves, faith in their own personal accomplishments, faith on the experiences of the past. But when your faith is on Jesus, in the present, in the future, Jesus says the sky's the limit. With me, all things are possible. This is not simply a call to have just faith, but actually faith in Jesus. You compare the disciples' faith in this passage to the faith of the Father. What does he say to Jesus? He says, I believe, but help my unbelief. He's saying, Lord, I have faith in you, but I want you to help me to have even more. You compare that to the disciples who thought, I've already been there, done that. Well, we've experienced this before. Okay, evil spirit, bad demon, go ahead and leave. Nothing. When you and I experience lack of accomplishment in the Lord's service, when there is nothing to mark God's working through us, it is not whatsoever a reflection of God's inability or His lacking power. It is, however, a clear reflection of your lack of faith and dependence in Him. The disciples were just coasting right into failure. Their coasting showed that failure was lurking. It showed that their faith was lacking. At my first house, I had some great neighbors on both sides. And facing my house to the left, I had some neighbors who had two really tall pine trees in their front yard. And I don't know if it was pine beetles or what, but something got into these trees, and in the span of a year, they were just dead. All the needles had fallen off, branches were starting to fall off, and I was particularly concerned about one of them because it was not simply leaning, but leaning towards my house. And that poses kind of a challenge. As some of you have experienced this before, you don't want to be that neighbor that your neighbors fuss about, and you don't want to be going to threaten them, so you better get this down. So I just didn't say anything, just hoping that soon they were going to get this tree down. Or these trees down. Anyway, I was sitting there at my desk one day doing some work on the computer, and I looked up out the window because I heard some car doors shut. And there in the cul-de-sac was this gray Pontiac Grand Prix that pulled up. And there were two guys that looked like they worked in the carnival that got out. They went to the trunk of the car, and they opened it, and they pulled out a chainsaw. I didn't give any thought to this, and so I hear in the distance this chainsaw roaring, and then I hear this big thud, and I look out the window, and the tree that's not leaning towards my house is already down. Well, I thought, are these carnies out there cutting trees down now? And so I go outside, and they have not only got one tree down, they've already got a notch out of the one that's leaning towards my house. And so I'm taking all this in. Guys that show up in Pontiac Grand Prix with a chainsaw in the trunk, just guessing they don't have insurance. These guys didn't even have teeth. So I'm thinking, no insurance concern, this may smack my house. And so I don't want to be conducting the Grand Inquisition, but I go out there and I just start talking to them, and I said, well, I don't know anything about tree cutting, but what's going to keep this tree from landing on my house, the one that's already got this notch out of it? He said, well, it's going to be how I cut it. And he points, he said, it's going to fall right here. Okay. So he goes to get his chainsaw to make the final cut. He starts pulling on it, will not start. Keeps pulling, will not start. At this point, he asks me, do you have a chainsaw? That doesn't breed confidence when your tree guys pull up in the Grand Prix with a chainsaw in the trunk that won't stay running. And so here I am faced with a dilemma, because this is the one that puts my house in jeopardy. I can go get the chainsaw, but that might be aiding and abetting them landing it on my bedroom. But then I could say, no, I don't have a chainsaw, or you can't use my chainsaw. And then there's this pine tree with a big notch already cut out of it. If the wind blows really hard that night, this tree's going to fall perhaps in the middle of the night right on my bed. Yeah, I've got a chainsaw. And so I go to the shed, I get the chainsaw out, he pulls it out, he cranks it up, makes one cut, and that tree, I'm not lying, within inches lands exactly where he said it was going to land. But you know what? If it were up to me, I wouldn't let those guys cut it in an azalea down. I mean, just based on my impressions, how I was taking everything in, I had absolutely no faith. I had absolutely no confidence in their ability. And you know what? If it had been up to me, I'd have missed out. If it had been up to me, I would have missed out. Listen, I want you to understand this. Your lack of present faith, your lack of present dependence on the Savior's ability, it's not costing Him, but it's sure costing you. When your faith is on the experiences and the successes of the past, things that you've been able to do, skills that you have put in your own personal tool belt, well, not only is failure lurking, but there's going to be successes you could experience, victories that you could be a part of, great things that God could be doing through you that you will miss out on. Why? Because of a lack of faith. But there's a final thing that we see based on the disciples' experience here that their coasting demonstrates, and that's this. It shows that prayer is absent. It shows that prayer is absent. And verse 25, Jesus speaks to this unclean spirit, to this demon, and He says, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter no more." And then and we can just imagine how horrific this sight is. Verse 26, this demonic spirit that's inside of this boy begins to speak out, cries out, causing the boy to tremble. He's convulsing greatly, but then the demon leaves. And we're told in verse 26, he became as one dead. So he's laying on the ground still and motionless, saying nothing, not moving an inch. So much so that people think the boy's dead. But the boy wasn't dead, and Jesus goes over and He stretches out His hand and He helps this boy up. And it seems that, and logically we can infer this, but we're told that people have gone into the house. You can imagine there's this great celebration, this enormous party. This boy who's been deaf and mute since birth, that's been possessed by this demon, has been made whole. He can hear, he can speak. Jesus has performed this amazing miracle. And so while everybody else has gone away, there's this intimate moment that the disciples have with Jesus in verse 28. They ask Him, "Jesus, why could we not cast it out? What was the matter with us?" And Jesus responds in verse 29, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." Don't misunderstand me in this. I'm not coming out whatsoever against fasting. But what I am saying this is that the phrase "and fasting" does not occur in the oldest manuscripts we have of Mark. We believe that was somehow added later. It's not that it's a bad thought, it's just not what Mark says. So Jesus actually says this kind can come out by nothing but prayer. This kind can come out by nothing but prayer. Jesus, why were we helpless to this young man? Why is it that we could do absolutely nothing? Why is it that when we spoke to the demon stayed there, but when you spoke to him, it was cast out? Jesus says that can only happen through prayer. Why could the disciples not do what at the outset they felt confident they could do? Because they were coasting on past experiences, past successes, past victories. That's what their faith was in. That was what their confidence was in. Their faith was lacking, and as a result, prayer was completely absent. Let me show you how that works. In what you've heard me mention before, my dad's mother, we called Granny. And Granny, throughout the course of her life, was fiercely, ruggedly independent. And even after my grandfather died in 1986, she did everything. She was an absolute workhorse. She would cut her grass, she would paint, she would work in the garden. She'd can literally hundreds of quarts of beans every year. Just an absolute workhorse. In the spring of 2009, though, she was diagnosed with metastatic colon cancer. By the time they found it, there was an enormous mass already on her liver. It was inoperable, chemo, radiation. There was no hope to be gained from that. And about a week or so after the diagnosis, she wound up just very, very sick, goes to the doctor. They determine that she's got a bowel obstruction. They send her to the emergency room. She has to have surgery to remove that obstruction. And, of course, abdominal surgery, especially like that, leaves you very weak. She was in her later 80s at this point, and so the doctor said she needs to go to the nursing home for some rehab to get over this surgery. Now, once she gets to the nursing facility, they were very clear and very explicit in these instructions. told Granny, listen, if you need to get up for any reason, you've got to ring the nurse's button and you've got to call us to get help. You're not to get out of this bed whatsoever without asking us to come and help you. Okay. So she hears all this, says that's what she's going to do. I don't know if it was the second or third night that Granny was there at that nursing home. My dad gets a phone call in the middle of the night. They'd taken Granny, rushed her to the emergency room. It turns out that she had a broken hip. All right, how did this happen? Well, in the middle of the night, she woke up, decided she needed to go to the bathroom, decided she wasn't going to use a walker, wasn't going to use the call button to ask for help, and she gets up, she goes to the bathroom. She's so weak, though, she falls, breaks her hip, has to have surgery to fix that. So now she's recuperating from 2 surgeries. That's how it happened. But let me ask you this. Why did it happen? Because Granny had it in her mind, I can do this without anybody. I can do this on my own. I'm not going to ask for help. The disciples asked Jesus, Jesus, why could we do nothing? We've done this before. They would do this later again. Why is it in this instance we could not do this? And Jesus says this can only happen by prayer. What's he talking about? He's talking about calling out to God and saying, Lord, I need you. I can't do this, but you can. Will you work in this circumstance? Will you demonstrate your power? Will you cast out this spirit? But the disciples didn't do any of that. Why? Because they, like Granny, decided, I can do this on my own. You know, there are so many things that we could and should pray about and talk to the Lord and ask for His help. And so many times we absolutely just don't do it. And the reason for that is the same reason for which Granny made her decision and the disciples did what they did. It's because we think, as they did, I don't need anybody's help. I can do this on my own. But do you remember Jesus' words in John 15, verse 5? He said, I am the vine, you are the branches. He that abides in me and I in him, the same beareth or bringeth forth much fruit. But then here's the kicker. He says, for apart from me, you can do what? Nothing. Apart from me, you can do nothing. What were the disciples trying to do? They were trying to operate apart from Him. And what could they do? Absolutely nothing. Why did the disciples fail that day? They were coasting on past successes, previous mountaintop moments, prior accomplishments. I can do this on my own. I don't need God's help. I don't need to talk to Him. I don't need to ask Him about it. And what did they accomplish? Absolutely nothing. We've been working our way through Mark in this series that I've called Time Flies. The premise, and you've heard me say it over and over again, it's been simple. Jesus had a very short ministry, just 3 years. A limited amount of time that passed very quickly, and in that time He accomplished everything that the Father set forth before Him to accomplish. Like Jesus, you and I have a limited amount of time here. And like Jesus, that time is passing very quickly. We've got no time to waste. No time to waste. No time to waste experience failures because we're coasting. You know, the sermon title this morning is What's Greek for Failure? I think I can answer that word with a non-Greek word. Coasting. Coasting. Let me ask you this. Is your walk with God marked by success? Is your walk with God marked by Him working through you and showing tangible fruit of His working in your life? If the answer is no, I'll tell you where that comes from. It comes from coasting. If that's you, let me ask you this. Are you tired of coasting? Are you ready for a fresh word, a fresh encounter, and fresh experience with the Lord? It can be yours if you want it. Won't you bow your heads with me?